Talk to us about your perspective on economic security and national security and how they're becoming increasingly intertwined.
On the issue of understanding economic policy and national security and how they're intertwined. And I would actually argue that the mistake that we make is that we say, are they connected? They're not connected, they're one. When we try to separate is when we start getting into trouble.
There's no better example of the intertwining of national security and economic security than our relationship with Europe. A $7 trillion economic relationship is secured by NATO.
We're stepping up in different ways, in more coordinated ways, and beginning to show the power of economic strength to handle national security.
It's my great pleasure to welcome this distinguished group of panelists here this morning for a conversation that I think is absolutely critical to American national security, and that is our economic security. Candy and I were actually just talking in the green room before this briefly about some family she has in a little town called Eureka, South Dakota. And I know Eureka well, it's a great little spot, but I think if you went to Eureka today and you asked folks there, do you believe that our economic security is tied to our national security? I think most of the people would say yes. They understand that there's a direct tie to being able to produce the goods and services we need here in America and how that impacts our national security, particularly in the post-COVID environment. And I think during my time at the Export-Import Bank, this was also the case, where I often found small businesses who were competing for international transactions would come in and say, we used to compete with companies for these transactions, but today we're competing with countries. And that's a distinct difference, right? Many of them would illustrate or articulate that China Inc. was their competitor for deals overseas, but it's not just China, there's other people at play here as well. And so we're gonna unpack this discussion today. So thank you again to Candy for introducing everybody and setting the stage. There's this concept out there that's a little tongue-in-cheek about China, quote unquote, eating our lunch, and others as well playing in this space. And so I'm gonna turn over to Amos first. So Amos, thanks for being here with us this morning. We're gonna talk energy in a little bit here, but if we kind of zoom out at the beginning, Amos, if you don't mind articulating for us, talk to us about your perspective on economic security and national security and how they're becoming increasingly intertwined. And maybe if you don't mind, do you believe China's eating our lunch, or are we actually driving the discussion here and doing our fair share?
So first, thank you for having me on the panel, and thanks for convening this. I think this conversation is really important, because I think you're right that Washington is probably behind the rest of the country on many issues, but specifically on the issue of understanding economic policy and national security and how they're intertwined. And I would actually argue that the mistake that we make is that we say, are they connected? They're not connected, they're one. There's no, and when we try to separate is when we start getting into trouble. And so I think that I will answer directly the question about about lunch, but let me start with what you suggested, to zoom out a little bit. We went from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era, and we're now in a different era, which is a global competition. And the competition is happening despite the fact that the headlines are filled with a war in Gaza and a war in Ukraine. By and large, the biggest part of national security strain is happening in the economic sphere. And if you take away those headlines and you look at what's happening, we're in the middle of these broad, dramatic, global transitions where we are skipping not one, but multiple generations of technology in two large buckets. They're all encompassing. One is the broader energy, and one is the broader tech. And I'll walk through how I think they're connected. So one is we're going towards a clean energy world, whether it takes, some people will think that it's gonna happen between now and 2030. Some people think it will happen in 2050. So let's get out of the climate arguments between different parties and just say, regardless of when it's going to happen, it's happening. And that is that a majority of the investment in energy around the world is in one side versus the other. And the question is, how long is this transition gonna be? Is it gonna be 10 years? Is it gonna be 50 years? But that's where we're going, and tens of billions of dollars are being spent on it. And so we have to plug into a new system. The second is the tech side. So whether it's from telecommunications, of where we've gone from, we essentially skipped 4G largely, went from 3 to 5G, we're gonna go to 6G and the abilities and what that brings us. We talked a lot about cloud in 2013, 14, 15 onwards. We now talk, I mean, you can't turn on a TV set without talking about AI, and that's connected to cloud, of course, and data centers going up all over the place. But here's where these things start blending. The origin story for renewable energy or clean energy or EVs is all in sort of very similar to the fossil fuel history. You have to mine the products somewhere around the world. You have to process them, so that's the upstream. You gotta have a midstream where you process them or smelt them or whatever you wanna, the different terms for different metals and minerals. And then you have to turn them into batteries and then put them into EVs, or you have to turn them into magnets for, very powerful magnets for wind energy, or into cells for solar. And some of those items are also necessary for nuclear. And some of them are necessary for semiconductors and chips, and they are required to build out the grid regardless of what the source of the energy is. And we need to build out the grid because AI is so power hungry that it needs massive amounts of electricity, and without that we will fall behind. So we normally grow our grid by a very small percentage a year to manage our growth. If we want to stay the leaders of the world in AI, we have to have the ability to build out the power system in the United States by massive amounts between now and 2027 and 2030, and that's just to keep pace with who? With the fact that the Chinese are trying to catch up. We're ahead in many of these areas, but we're not ahead in all of them. So we have to have international relationships because most of this stuff is not only found in the United States. And so we have to have a foreign policy and a national security that understands our economic policy, what our interests are, so that we can invest in other places and ensure that we have the supply chains to be able to do these two massive competitive areas of the economy that we are trying to stay ahead in or catch up in. And to do that, it's not like the old days. You can't just come to a country and say, we're America, you should sell it to us. Because our money is our government money is slow and relatively small, while you said in your presentation at the beginning, other countries are not coming with their corporations, they're coming with their central banks, their sovereign wealth funds, who can write a check right away. So how do you compete with that? And if I go to my right, and I say, why don't you finance some of these projects? Now we talk about local currency risk, and we talk about reputational risk and all these things, and say, almost if you have a 25% return, we will make the financing work. The Chinese don't ask that question. Right. They don't ask what your values are. They just write the check and say, what percentage of the product are you going to send to China and make sure it's not available to the United States? So that's what we need to be very honest about. It's not a level playing field. It is not even. So what we have to do is to come up with a different mindset, number one, which I think we have, and then change how we do investments around the world so that we can represent a diversified global economy that secures America's interests, but also secures the rest of the world's interests, so we don't have, in the future, the OPEC of technology, the OPEC of energy. Why? Because in the 1970s, we had a number of countries in OPEC that controlled our oil system and put us in economic disadvantage because they could put an embargo. We can find ourselves in the same situation. So our national security has to catch up to our economic structures that we, the US government, can use our tools to finance this kind of investment strategy. So we use relatively small dollars, but in a very effective way that leverages up the private sector money. So we solve the problems of Citibank, of whoever the fund is, and say, we will de-risk the investments. But this has to happen not at just economic agencies of the US government. It has to happen at the National Security Council, at the State Department, at the Defense Department. We have to use all the tools that we have. And no, I don't think China is eating our lunch. I think they have a 20-year head start on some of these. Some of these products, they have 80%. I'll give you one example and I'll close. 97% of graphite is processed in China. So regardless of where you mine it, even if you mine it in the United States, it has to go to China for processing. 97%. Now go down copper, lithium, and so on. They are all in high percentages, 50%, 60%, 70%, either the mining or the processing controlled by China. We will not win if that is true. So we have to change our mindset and make those investments as the United States in order to be able to compete.
Thank you for that. I wouldn't be a good South Dakotan if I didn't also mention, as part of that all of the above energy policy, we certainly hope biofuels are part of that, and I'm sure some of the Farmers for Prosperity here today would agree with me on that front. So General Lute, moving over to you next, if you don't mind. We have a $7 trillion commercial relationship with our friends in Europe. And you were former ambassador to NATO. By the way, thank you for your service for our country. NATO and the Marshall Plan were born sort of together, and there was a sort of economic and national security concepts that have always been interlinked in this space. Can you talk about how you see these two pillars moving together and playing out from your vantage point and your experience to date?
Well, first of all, it is good to be back with USGLC, and this is a great venue and a great initiative to bring this group together. You know, there's no better example of the intertwining of national security and economic security than Europe, than our relationship with Europe. I mean, you mentioned the data here, $7 trillion. A $7 trillion economic relationship is secured by NATO, arguably the most durable, strongest, most important security arrangement that we have. So, I mean, Europe exemplifies this intertwining of economics and national security. And, you know, this shouldn't come as a big surprise to us. I mean, after World War I and World War II, right, we said, essentially, in 45, we're not doing that again, right? And we took on a different approach. And the approach actually started not with a security arrangement, but with economic integration. I mean, a key attribute of the Marshall Plan was that the allies who signed up to receive Marshall Plan assistance had to integrate their economies. And the deal here was that initial economic integration, breaking down trade barriers, sharing markets, and so forth, right, would lead to political integration. And then 2 years after the Marshall Plan, in 49, NATO was founded in order to secure that deal. So this goes all the way back into the years immediately following World War II. I don't think there's any better example today of the connection between economics and security than what we've seen our NATO allies do, our European allies do, in the last 2 years, since February 22 and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In 2 years' time, Europe has re-engineered its primary energy sources away from the unreliable supplies of Russia to other sources. I mean, that's amazing. If I had Amos here 2 years ago and said, look, what's the bet that Europe's going to be able to do this in a meaningful time frame, 2 years? I don't know what he would say, but I would have said, no way, right? No way. And yet they've done that. So there's a very current case study here of this connection between secure energy and national security. And then I want to play off of one other thing Amos said. You know, he said, our competition with China is not a level playing field. I agree with that if we take on a one-on-one perspective, the United States versus China. The thing that levels the playing field in our favor, in fact, I would argue tips it in our favor, is our alliance structures, right? We should be competing with China looking forward in an uneven, unfair playing field. One that's to our advantage. And that's because, for example, with Europe, if you combine European GDP with our GDP, you're up to something like 50% of global GDP. That's the power with which we should be competing with China. So when we get to the fundamental question of what are the values of these relationships, and aren't we being ripped off? And isn't this altruism that's been now outdated? No, the reality is it's very much an insurance that we should be buying for the future, especially if we believe in the competition with China.
Amen. Amen. Candy, over to you. Both of these gentlemen have articulated that there's an important role that the private sector plays. I've worked with Citibank in my time at the Export-Import Bank, and I'm sure you've worked with a number of other private sector entities on these exact matters. I can't imagine the types of things that come across your desk on a weekly basis. What trend lines are you looking at from a global economic security perspective, and what should we be thinking about as this audience here today?
Yeah, well, as I think both Doug and Amos noted, you need the private sector engagement, and certainly as the most global bank, we try to engage, but we need the support. And having government action to help direct and determine and then help facilitate, whether it's through XM, it's through DFC, it's through other support from both the US and frankly international governments for IDBs and just sort of organizations that can help to leverage the private sector dollars. But I think maybe just stepping back for a minute, as Amos noted, right, diversification is happening. We're using the term diversification. Some people say de-risk, some people say decouple. I would say diversify because the supply chains are changing. But it's going to take a while for the supply chains to change. And government action is facilitating the speed by which it's happening, but there still has to be places to land and where investment can flow. And that's where it's really important for this effort and also private sector engagement to help countries determine how to improve their rule of law, to deal with corruption, to make the new locations viable options for further changes in supply chains, because only then will you get to the point where you have comfort that as economic security and national security are intertwined, that you get the national security benefits by knowing that the supply chains are diversifying and the changes are occurring because you can determine where they're going to go. And moving out of China or moving into Mexico or moving into Vietnam or figuring out where those changes are going to occur is something that I think both help from government, but support of the private sector will help to move that diversification. I think there was a question around risks. I think in the corporate world, you have to be really careful around too much naked protectionism, if I can call it that, in the name of national security, because there still is an economic point that happens and there is value to trade. And we need to ensure that for folks here in the audience, that there is markets to which you can trade into and the strength, because ultimately at the end of the day, in my view, it's the exceptionalism of America, it's the exceptionalism of the dollar, it's the exceptionalism of the US strength of our economy that is going to drive that national security, and we have to keep America exceptional. And that means we have to ensure that we're strong at home economically, that we built it up, and we make sure that for every business and for opportunities that there is some trade and an ability to sell into a market. And so you've got to find the balance between the importance of national security, the importance of diversification, and I think the effort for this group and this effort for this global hub will be able to help find that appropriate balance and be able to drive American exceptionalism so we can be exceptional at home and exceptional abroad.
Thank you very much. Amen to that. You're speaking my language. I love it. So I'm going to move back to you, Amos, on some more competition questions here. So China has increased their global development investments by over 525% in roughly the last number of years here. I remember when I was at the Export-Import Bank, we often talked about how they did more export credit financing than the G7 countries combined. So they're heavily invested in this space. We see it all over Africa. I was with Liz Schreier in Kenya a year ago, and we saw, even the toll booths there look like Chinese pagodas. And I remember just thinking how shocking that was. So as we think about those kinds of investments that they're making, are we investing in the right sorts of activities as well? And we probably won't ever match them dollar for dollar or yuan for yuan, but are we making the right investment strategically right now from your perspective?
So I think that's the right question. I think we are, and I think I'd like to address two things that were raised here in wrapping this answer. One, when I talk about the level playing field, I don't talk about, I agree with you. The level playing field is tilting in our direction because of not just Europe, but I look at the G7 plus, put Australia and South Korea and Japan and several other countries, and I think folks in some of our allies in the Gulf are investing with us. That gives us a massive advantage. I meant that on the financial side, people talk about, you're America, you're a free market. I said, great, free market, I'll win. But if somebody comes in and says, I'll finance the project at zero interest, and there's no risk assessment, and I can do it in 10 days, that's not a level playing field and it doesn't have to be commercial. There's no requirement for it to be commercial, then that doesn't work. That's why we launched at the G7 just in the last 18 months, and CEO of Citibank, Jane Fraser, we asked her to come together with an American CEO of the largest infrastructure fund, GIP, Bioinformatics. And the two of them, we asked them we brought the G7 leaders to have both Jane Fraser and Bio say to them, all right, what would it take for you, what do we, the governments of the G7, need to do investment-wise for you to spend money on these kinds of projects that previously you considered to be too risky? And they gave us a list, and we've been working through that list. And I think the G7 is in about 10 days from now is the next G7. And I think that we're going to be showing that we've catalyzed and invested close to $60 billion just the United States, plus another about 50 to 60 billion for the rest of the G7. And I know that Jake Sullivan was here earlier today and mentioned the Libido Corridor, which was our first test of this. And what that does is not just build a rail from a port on the west coast of Africa all the way through Zambia, Angola, Zambia, and DRC, but rather it invests in a number of sectors at the same time. So you get the access point to the critical minerals, that's true. But somebody talked to you about the ag before on the AI, but investing in the ability to connect markets so that you're not depending on foreign markets. That there was only one Chinese-based telecom company. An American company is now there and has in less than 2 years gained 40% market share on all equipment that's coming from the United States and South Korea. We approved $900 million for solar energy in 4 states in Angola through Exim Bank. And just 3 days ago, Exim Bank approved another $1.5 billion for the same American company with American equipment, mini grids, in Angola. Angola used to be a country that was not exactly friendly relations with the US. Today is one of the our strongest allies. But this now gives us reach into 3 or 4 countries. And why do they favor the US over doing the business with the Chinese? Because they say, I'll choose US, European, Japanese, Australian companies any day. I know what that does, but you're not there. So the reason we don't compete is because if we're not in the room, if we don't bid, we don't win the contract. So we haven't been bidding, and we now need to start bidding. And so if this group asks me, what do we need to do? We need to have a DFC that has gotten, I think Congress gave, and this is a bipartisan product, the DFC, but it didn't finish the job. It needs more authorities. It needs to be able to be faster. It shouldn't take 18 to 24 months to approve a finance package. It should take faster. We should be able to take equity. Exim Bank should be able to do more. We should increase. Those tools today are as important as our military. You want to prepare for a war of the future with adversaries? We should prepare for that. That's tens of billions of dollars. I'm not arguing with that. But you can't have $50, $60 billion on a defense war and $100 million on the economic war. We have to be better tooled for that. So what we've put together is working with the World Bank. We're going to announce some of these structures to mitigate that risk, which is what Jane had asked us to do. It's been a lot of work. And we're going to announce a few more $1 billion from the private sector to go along with the DFC and Exim Bank. So I don't think our lunch is being eaten at all. because the advantage that Doug was talking about, everybody knows that we are, together with Europe and the rest, the greater part is 60%, but we are also the favorite partner because we do it commercially. So the libido corridor that Jake talked about, we're now doing 4 or 5 of these corridors around the world. And that's what people want us to do, and that's what every company around the country is going to benefit from if we can be at the forefront of those kind of transactions.
I'm sure you've heard this, because I've heard it myself, which is when we go to China, we get a bridge, we go to the US, we get a lecture. So you're combating that idea, right, which is leveraging these tools of strategic competition to make sure that we can actually execute on these transactions.
The PGI has spent $6 billion in Africa in the last couple of years alone. Mm-hmm. That is more than we have done collectively, cumulatively, for several years. And I use that line myself about us.
Yeah.
And I said, we're not here to give a lecture. I'm here to see what does it take for an American company to get this business, or a G7 country. I advocate sometimes for Australian companies or German companies or Japanese. But we now have the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Japan saying, how do we invest alongside you because we see what you're doing? The data center in Kenya that was announced last week is a UAE Microsoft data center. The DFC financed a data center in Ghana, and we're going to do one in Zambia. We're doing the Luzon corridor in the Philippines. These are the kind, and that will, if we can do the Luzon corridor, that will be $1 billion from an American company I won't name, from the US, that says they'll spend money there that will enable them to invest triple that in the United States.
Love it. Thank you, sir. General, over to you again. So what we're talking about, some technology needs and things, I think there's an understanding that folks are a little wary about Chinese technology or technology made in other particular, bad actors around the world versus American technology. But yet sometimes we aren't leading in some of these areas where we're setting the standards, we're engaged, we're the ones out in front. I worked in the Clean Network Initiative, for example, and those kinds of projects I think are important to help set American standards and make sure that we are in that lead capacity. Talk about it from your perspective. How are we doing on that effort in terms of the U.S. being the standard setter, the U.S. being the one out in front on the leading edge technology, and making sure our diplomats and our military have access to those cutting edge opportunities?
Well, a couple of quick points. I think, first of all, we need to appreciate that many of the emerging technologies, like the ones that were mentioned just in Liz's short presentation just preceding us, are dual purpose technologies, right? And today, the commercial sector, the private sector, is leading in the development of those technologies. But in every case, AI, quantum computing, bioengineering, robotics, in every case, there's a significant national security defense application, right? It used to be that the NASAs of the world, the US government investment in advanced technology, would lead the private sector. That's now inverted, right? It's the private sector that's leading government investment. So the first thing we need to understand is that these are two-edged swords, right? They are dual-purpose technologies. And I think one of the interesting plays here recently has been an increased awareness in Europe among our European allies in the mass communications sector, right? And this is the move away from Huawei and a Chinese opportunity because they appreciated that investing in Huawei, or further investing in Huawei, which is really the case in Europe, right, really carries with it national security risks. So I think that's the first thing. We have to appreciate that these are dual purpose. The other thing, though, I want to play off of something Amos said. Look, we've got the investment scheme here at the national budget level. It's too heavily skewed towards the $50 billion defense budget. And I'm a military guy, right? But you can't compete reasonably with an $850 billion defense budget and a State Department budget something like 1/16 or 1/17 that size. And most telling thing here, on a number of boards and so forth that take me overseas and put me in contact today in my semi-retired life with US embassies, right? And you go to a US embassy, the defense attache's office in the embassy, so DOD's presence in the embassy, outnumbers the econ section, outnumbers probably one person from commerce, Maybe if it's a large embassy, another person from Treasury, right? And then we wonder why our relationships, our bilateral relationships, are skewed towards military solutions. You go into the back office of an embassy and you have, Wang computers, okay? Sorry, I know I'm dating myself here, right? But you have systems, they're not enabled with the technology, much less the artificial intelligence tools that are emerging, right? They don't have the last generation of meaningful technology. So if we want to get serious about this connection between economic security and national security, we're going to have to spend like it. And that, I think, means a reform, in effect, of the president's budget and of the congressional appropriations process that doesn't bring these one-on-one. It doesn't have to be equal, but it's got to be less of a gap in favor of an increase towards economic security.
You're not a fan of the congressional appropriations process?
Well, to the extent it plays out at all, but as C.Q. Brown said, basically they just continue to punt.
Yeah. Candy, I'm going to come back over to you. We have just a minute here left.
Yeah,
Yes,
I just wanted to make a couple,
Please.
I think maybe summary points. Look, I think what's really important is 10 years ago, we weren't even really having a conversation that economic security and national security were intertwined. And in the last 10 years, we've been having that conversation. The fact that we're here today talking about these issues, as Amos has said, there's efforts at the G7, there's global efforts, there's a move to try to better catalyze government dollars and private sector dollars. And is it perfect? No, not yet, because we're all figuring it out. But there's a lot of change and a lot of effort going on, and I think USGLC will be a pivotal part to helping to promote those efforts. But I'm really optimistic about the changes that have been occurring, and that we're stepping up in different ways, in more coordinated ways, and beginning to show the power of economic strength to handle national security. And I would just say one thing: I hope that as we make modifications, and we talked about this previously, that we actually have a sign somewhere that says "supported by the U.S."
Amen.
You don't go anywhere in the world and sort of see, you get a little sign, a little plaque that maybe says XM financing or DFC, but how about financed by the US to give us further strength as we go forward? It's just a little marketing ploy that we should be thinking about. So with that.
Amen to that. We have done better on that front with our food aid. I don't know if you've seen the food aid packages that say "from the American people," but it definitely does a good job branding that.
Yeah.
We're out of time, but I do want to just ask one final question. If you're forecasting a year out, what is the one thing that you expect will change the most on the economic security, national security, overall landscape in the next year? Just quick one-hitter, one area you think will have changed the most a year from today if we had this conversation next year this time? I'll start with Candy right at the end and work your way down. How's that?
Give us a little time to think.
Right.
Yeah.
I gave mine that I think we're going to be in a position where, a lot of the changes starting to occur will have better catalyzed the U.S. resources, and I'm hoping we'll have like a sign.
So a sign.
Yes.
A sign.
I'm going to make a sign and send it to.
We should be able to do that.
I'm going to do a
We can do
selfie
that
with
next year.
signs.
It can't be that
wherever
hard.
I go. I think the president's going to love that. I think that we're going to see, we have done a tenfold jump. I think we're going to see a massive jump in American and plus allies investment in developing and middle income countries. And I think we'll see Congress a year from now coming along and increasing the appropriations for not just Commerce Treasury, but for MCC, DFC, Exim Bank.
That's great.
Yeah, and I just echo that. Look, this really has to do with the budget. We have to not just talk a good game, we have to be willing to invest where it counts. And so rebalancing this imbalance between defense and the economic tools of the US government are really important. It comes down to people and technology. And we have these, they're available, but we have to put them to work.
Great, thank you all. Please join me in thanking our guests today.